So guys, wrapping up a chain adjustment on this 2025 GSXR 1000. And I want to take you through some of the steps of the procedure of adjusting the chain. Most of this will apply to pretty much any motorcycle that you're working on. So we're going to talk about measuring the slack in the chain, setting the back spacing for the rear axle, and tightening up that axle nut. So let's dive into it. Tools that you're going to need. You need a ruler so you can measure the slack in the chain. For this bike, we're going to use a 12 millimeter for the lock nut, a 10 millimeter for the bolt that stops the axle from moving forward. This bike takes a 36 millimeter for the axle nut, half-inch ratchet, calipers. Some of you guys may laugh at this, but I am a little bit anal with my settings. So yes, we will go over how to measure with calipers as well. And you're going to need a torque wrench, one that will go up to 100 Newton meters or 72.5 foot-pounds. That is the torque spec for the axle nut. Oh yeah, one other thing I almost failed to mention. Get yourself some bobbins and a paddock stand. Makes doing this job far and away easier. All right, guys, so with your ruler, and I'm hoping this shows up on camera, notice that I'm trying to line up the 3 on the ruler here. There we go. Trying to line up that 3 right on one of the rivets. The specification for chain slack, when measured somewhere in between the rear sprocket and the front sprocket, is between 20 and 30 millimeters. Well, measuring at 3, for every 3 to 4 is going to be 10 millimeters. So 3, there's 10, there's 20, and this one's checking in right around 25, which is right in the middle. I'm going to move the chain around a little bit. There we go. 30, 40, 50, and a little bit more. That's how you're going to measure the slack in your chain. And here's a little bit more of an explanation on that, since I can understand if that was a little bit difficult to see, because that was difficult to see through the camera. But that rivet was sitting right here on that number 3. And again, from 3 to 4 is 10 millimeters. From 4 to 5 is another 10 millimeters for a total of 20. And then from there on up, it was falling just the other side of the 5, close to 25 millimeters of slack. And again, the spec on this motorcycle is 20 to 30 millimeters of slack. So next in the procedure, guys, we're going to loosen the axle nut. So notice we are using our ratchet to loosen that nut. You don't ever want to use your torque wrench for this. It can wreck the settings. But the other thing is I'm also not touching the adjusters. The last thing that you want to do is start fooling with the adjusters, maybe make a mistake and tighten them instead of loosening them while that axle is tight. You can strip out the swing arm, or you could, at best case scenario, strip out that actual bolt itself. Either way, you're not going to be having a good time after that. So always remove any kind of tension off of that axle first, then move to your adjusters. Now guys, note where your stop is in relationship to these marks on the swing arm. Both sides have them, and they are to be marked as where the axle is on both sides of the swing arm. You want to make sure that you are getting this as close to identical as you can. In this case, you can see where that stop is just right in the middle of that longer hash mark, right there. And it's right in the middle of that mark on this side too. Now, there's no hard and fast rule as to how much it is going to affect the chain tension for every mark, but I can promise you that even 1/8 of a turn on this bolt here, that stop bolt, is going to make a significant difference in the chain. So what you're going to do is you're going to want to make sure that when you loosen your lock nut and you start to unscrew, in essence, these bolts, in other words, make them go back towards the back of the motorcycle, that is what's going to start to add tension to that chain. Measure it often so that you don't over tighten the chain. That's another thing that guys can possibly do, and that'll get you in trouble. The marks are just there as reference. They don't mean any kind of a specific amount of adjustment per mark. It's just so that you can judge how far back the axle is on both sides of the swing arm. And so for me, this is also where I will use a set of calipers. Setting this right to the back of the swing arm, I will push until there is a positive stop. When there is a positive stop, I will check and see that that is what, about 22, almost 23 millimeters. I'll then come around to the other side, go through the same procedure, and note that it is also between 22 and 23 millimeters. I personally like to keep that measurement within a half a millimeter at the most of itself. And to give you guys an idea, my bike was off by a full millimeter on both sides. The width of that mark is exactly by how much it was off one side to the next. So just because you got your bike back from the dealership, it doesn't mean that from the factory it wasn't set up exactly perfect. There are going to be some measurements and some things you need to adjust to make sure that everything is right. Now, once you get both sides adjusted properly, without locking down that lock nut, you're going to give the back of the tire a couple of nice hard thumps. Make sure that it is seated up against those stops. And then you are going to carefully lock down that lock nut. You don't have to try to put a ton of torque into it. Just make sure that it is positively locked down. Repeat the procedure for the other side. Again, just locking everything down and checking to make sure that nothing is moved and that there's no gap between this bolt and the stop. Double check your back spacing on both sides and start tightening your axle nut. Now, it's going to take 72.5 foot-pounds or 100 Newton meters to tighten this nut down. As you're doing it, again, with your ratchet, not your torque wrench, you just want to keep checking as it starts to get tight that nothing has moved around, that everything is still right where you had left it, and then go ahead and put a little muscle into it before you torque that thing down to its specs. And from here, guys, I'll give the chain a couple of spins, and then I will measure it again just to make sure that I have everything right where it needs to be, making sure that there's no wobbling or anything like that with the sprockets or any kind of funny business like that. But at that point, you have adjusted the chain on your motorcycle. So I hope that helps you guys out. Post up your comments, and we will catch you on the next one. Thanks for stopping by.